Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Hello. So in this module, we'll be looking at what happened in translation from the Renaissance to the modern period, roughly speaking. So we know now what happened up to the Renaissance in the. We know now what happened in translation up to the Renaissance in various cultures of the world. So we are now looking at what happened after the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, as you know, was a game-changing social movement, a movement which freed the world from the shackles of feudalism. It was a new horizon before them, before the people who initiated the movement. The rise of a new humanism, a human-centered approach, free from medieval religiosity, opening up new worlds for the Europeans. The voyages of discovery were initiated during this time. You find Europeans sailing to all corners of the world, what is known as geographical exploration. And of course, the rise of mercantile capitalism, a new form of social organization, what is called early capitalism, not the full-fledged industrial capitalism that came later. Okay, we find traces of this in all the important literary texts in Europe, so we don't have to explain it really. Okay, and of course, it's set off what we call European colonialism. European colonialism, which is unlike any other earlier forms of colonialism. Okay, colonialism which aimed at exploiting territories rather than colonizing them. On the whole, there were also settler colonies like the United States of America or Canada, but on the whole, even Latin America had settler colonies. But on the whole, the aim was of exploitation of the colonies. And from this point onwards, we find that translation is a globally integrated phenomenon, something that covers the whole world, something that takes into account cultural differences and either manages it or manipulates it. Right. Now, Europe at this time, all the national languages of Europe were fully developed. It was ripe for a massive exercise in translation. All the languages fully developed, all the languages developing branches of knowledge, and to top everything, we have the printing as a means of mass producing books. So you have a common culture, European culture, mass production of books, dozens of languages which are very closely knit together. Okay, but they were abundant communication. We know that England and France were virtually one country till the English king lost his territories in France. But the communication continued. Cultural exchanges continued. So same was the case with other languages like French and German, Swedish and Norwegian, Spanish and Portuguese. So many languages, and above all, we also have Turkish, basically a non-Indo-European language, but now more or less integrated into Europe. Turkey is still integrated, remains integrated in Europe. Okay, now look at this interesting bit of information. The first book published in English was a translation. This was a translation of an original work in French by Raoul Lefebvre. And the translator was none other than William Caxton, the first printer in English. It is titled Requel of the Histories of Troy. Of course, the title has a different spelling, not what you expect today. 2 Y's instead of an I. Okay, all right. Now, this was the first printed book in English. Of course, Caxton also printed other books like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, almost at the same time. In any case, printing facilitated not only the publication of books in the original, but also translation. And as I said, Europe was a multilingual society. Almost every country in Europe was a multilingual society. And here, printing served to underline that fact further. Okay. Now, what else was happening in Europe? You have a large number of translations from Greek and Latin into modern European languages. So, till the Renaissance, translations were chiefly from Latin. Latin was the language of knowledge. Latin was the language of religion. Okay, everything, church services were in Latin. So, Latin was the source language most of the time. But this changed with the Renaissance. We know of the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453. That's a game-changing event. And it is said that many scholars escaped with original Greek texts from Constantinople or Byzantium, whatever you want to call it, current Istanbul, modern day Istanbul. So when they escaped, they went to different countries of Europe, taking the books with them. That is just one event. Even otherwise, Greek texts were becoming available from other sources as well. There were Arabic translations of Greek texts done during the medieval period. So there was an abundant activity of translation from Greek also, apart from Latin. And one must also remember that Latin continued to be a language for writing original texts. Newton's Principia Mathematica was written in Latin. Many works of our well-known poet Milton of the 17th century were written in Latin. So Latin continued to be a language of original writing as well. So this was the situation. And of course, there were plenty of literary texts translated, either translated or imitated. We know of French comedies of the 16th century imitated by post-restoration dramatists in English. Yeah. So literary exchanges were also rife. And this is interesting. We have a number of writers and translators talking about translation. This writer and translator called Dole in French, Etienne Dole, Chapman, who translated Homer, Dryden, Pope. Many of these poets translated from Latin. And they talk about it. Take Dryden, for example, talking about a threefold division in translation: metaphrase, paraphrase, imitation. Metaphrase is simply a word for word translation. Paraphrase is a sense for sense translation. And imitation is something like our modern adaptation, imitating a text, writing a text of your own, keeping the original SL text in mind. So their views were echoed, especially Dryden's views were echoed by the German philosopher and poet Goethe. His name is pronounced Goethe, Goethe. And a writer and critic called Edmund Carey, CRY, notes that Bible translations continued to be made. We know that many Bible translations happened in English in the 16th century. Translations of all types. Translation by Protestants, translation by Catholic, various denominations of Protestants, not just one Protestant denomination, several denominations, separate groups of Protestants. And Carey notes that Bible translation was a battleground for Catholics and Protestants. Okay, if you translate in a certain way, it would echo the ethics of either Catholicism or Protestantism, and then a big dispute would occur. Okay, there are plenty of such disputes. I'm not going into those now, but the Bible translation occasioned such disputes. And a little later, in 1792, late 18th century, you have this full-fledged book on translation appearing. That is by an English author called Alexander Fraser Tytler. And his book is titled Essay on the Principles of Translation, published in 1792. So I'm not aware. I don't think probably there is another book, an earlier book than this in world history, exclusively on translation. First book on translation. So it discusses various types of translation, all those translation types we discussed earlier, whether it should be word for word, sense for sense, free translation, whether the translation should be poetic, whether the translation should imitate the style of the source language, or whether it should follow the given existing style of the target language. All these issues are discussed. So the book is a little less than 200 pages. You will find a free copy for downloading in Gutenberg.org, famous site for archived books. You will get the whole book in, I think, 2 or 3 forms, including PDF. It's worth reading. All translation scholars ought to read it. All learners of translation. So it discusses types of translation. It discusses different genres in translation, different linguistic units and expressions in translation, with examples, plenty of examples. And he has discussed some of the important works which were translated, okay, some of the important authors. And of course, there are general principles of translation, what to do on a particular occasion, what does a particular kind of translation imply, what does it indicate, what does it mean aesthetically, right? And then what was happening in Europe at this time? A new literary movement was on the rise, the Romantic movement. We know about Romantic poets in English, arriving at the end of the 18th century. We know about Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, Byron, all these major Romantic poets, as well as other poets who could be called Romantic, like Sati. So they had a particular ideology, thinking, notion about translation. What they thought about translation was that it cannot be a faithful business, because their literatures were self-contained. You can't think of a foreignizing translation. The idea that was floated later by Lawrence Venuti in the late 20th century. A translation which reads like a translation. When you read it, you immediately realize it's a translation. So this the Romantic poets could not agree with. So they thought a translation, if at all you want to translate something, it must be like recreating the text. Shelley said it's like a new plant sprouting. So without doing that, without recreating a text, you can't think of translation. So years later, our Robert Frost, the iconic American poet, remarked that poetry is what is lost in translation. So I think he had Shelley's idiom, axiom in mind. So if you are trying to translate a poem, it will be destroyed. Rather, if you recreate it, it will come alive, as Shelley said. I think that's what Frost meant. And Frost has been criticized for saying this. But I think the idea is clear, what he was trying to say. Okay. So the Romantics did not think much of translation. Okay. They thought, why do we need translation when we are creating our own literature, when we are creating our own culture? And all literatures and languages were self-contained entities. So the poet get also talked about the autonomy of German literature. In fact, he positioned German literature as the best literature in the world. Okay. And his idea of world literature was translations from German into other literature. In fact, disseminating major or hegemonic literature to the world. Right. But a little later, in the mid 19th century, Matthew Arnold, poet, critic, and philosopher, talked about uh, translation producing the same effect on its readers as the original did on its readers. So this idea was floated in the essay called On Translating Homer. It's available for free download from the net. So, of course, he was a poet and critic who talked about the sublime in literature. Whatever was great, whatever was exceptional in world literature. So this sublime literature had to be taken on its own terms. So if you are translating Homer, it should produce the same kind of effect on the readers in translation as it produced in on the readers of the original text. So this is a very controversial idea, much debated, much criticized, but I think this is what Arnold meant. So this is definitely a kind of foreignizing translation, although Arnold doesn't make it clear how this is to be done. Like, for example, if this is to be done, there must be the same kind of expressional power in both languages, the same kind of idiom, the same kind of reading habits. All these are there, but Matthew Arnold doesn't elaborate. He more or less leaves, but the idea is a good one for discussion. And then all these notions on translation during the age of industrial capitalism and colonial expansion, 18th and 19th centuries mostly. It's worth looking at some of these. These are found scattered in the works of translators, poets, and literary scholars. So one would be a scholarly translation. A scholarly translation which recognizes the preeminence of the source language text. You grant it its grandeur. It's a great text. Okay. And you have to pay obeisance to it. What Venuti would call a foreignizing translation, roughly speaking. We are not talking about how it operates at the level of the languages. Right. Two, a foreignizing translation, which reads like a translation, which is intended to encourage the reader to go to the original work. Although I don't know if it is possible for all readers to do that. So unlike today a translation is primarily meant for readers who cannot understand the source language. But in the 19th century, this was not so. Reading, it was on the verge of becoming a popular pastime. Okay, but not yet. The working class were not yet into reading. So it was still the concern of an elite. All right. So this was one of the approaches to translation. Then number 3, the translator as a kind of wizard, a magician, okay, who takes out of his hat a palatable version for the TL reader. The target language reader wants to read something which he would take to, like immensely. So the translator produces it. Probably our prime example is Edward Fitzgerald, who translated some of the rubaiyats of Umar Khayyam from Persian. So there are many controversies about whether the text was authentic or so. But the point is that Edward Fitzgerald took many liberties with the original text. He said that these people are a very uncouth people, uncivilized. So I can take whatever liberties I want with them. He explicitly said so in the preface. Much discussion has occurred on that. But remember, this was one of the approaches to translation, one of the many approaches. Then finally, this is closely related to the third approach I was talking about just now, about a translator who works like a mentor, an editor improving the source language text, because the source language text is found to be of a lower status, almost like what Fitzgerald thought. Okay, but more systematic. Okay, and this has been practiced in very interesting ways. For example, a French translation of Homer's Iliad, in which a scene from a context from the epic was rewritten, where the king, in fact, when the warrior Patroclus is cremated, the king himself takes a splinter and puts it into fire, symbolically. Just like you are throwing a handful of soil over a grave when a person is buried. So this the French translator found of very bad taste. How can a king do that? That was the time of the Sun King Louis XIV. You can't think of a king doing such a lowly thing. So what did he do? He changed it. He removed the scene altogether. This is a good example, right? And then what was happening in China? In China, we saw the translations of Buddhist texts lasting up to the 8th or 10th centuries. Here, now, in 16th century, there were Christian monks translating the Bible. Several of them had connections with India, especially monks who were temporarily stationed in Goa. They went to Chinese territories like Macau, which was a Portuguese colony. And then they tried to produce Chinese translation as a part of missionary activities. And then, a little later, attempts were made to translate European literature into Chinese, basically knowledge texts. Okay, of course, science and philosophy had taken a different direction in China, but even then, attempts were made to acquaint themselves with what was happening in Europe. And when you come to the end of the 19th century, you find certain interesting experiments. For example, a translator called Lin Shu had translated many Victorian novels, including Charles Dickens's novels. He knew no English. What he did was to rely on people who were fluent in English or French, whatever language he was translating. They would narrate the story. They would even show him illustrations of the original publications. And Lin Shu would, on the basis of what he heard, produce translation. This is not very strange or unknown in the world of translation. There was a poet in Malayalam who translated Shakespeare's Hamlet in this way. A Malayalam poet called Kunyakuttan Thampuran in the early 20th century. Just from what people told him about the plot of the play. Okay. And some people say, although people have come down on such an attempt, calling it very foolish and disrespectful to the original author, others have pointed out that he produced certain good verses, couplets and slokas based on what he heard of semi-poetical utterances in Hamlet. So this is not a very unknown or strange activity. People have done that. And then there were also attempts to translate Chinese into literature into foreign languages. A writer, poet and philosopher called Lin Yu Ta. We know of him. We know of some of his works. So these translators tried to take Chinese literature into the world. And of course, the most interesting Chinese movement for translation was the translations produced by the May 4th movement after the establishment of the Communist Party in China in May 4th, 1990. And they, in fact, wanted to create a world library. A world library of world classics in Chinese. So there was profuse translation activities. Hundreds of translators were probably involved. And of course, the process of the Chinese Revolution disrupted this world library movement. But it had already produced several European texts in Chinese translation. And in India, of course, during this time, especially the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, there were translations into English. The colonial translators were at work. We know about John Will's translation. So we know about William Jones's translation of the Abhijnana Shakuntala, Kalidasa's classic, into English. It became so famous in Europe. Within 2 years, they had a German translation, a translation by a translator called Georg Foster. In fact, the poet and philosopher Goethe was astounded by the quality of the work when he said that he placed the book on his head and danced. And he even composed 4 lines on the Shakuntala, which became very famous. And of course, the other texts like Bhagavad Gita and Manusmriti were also translated. So this was the age of Orientalism, a movement which kind of eulogized Indian scholarship and tradition. So a number of translations were made. There were translations also of books on Islamic jurisprudence, written in Persian originally. And an interesting thing about translation in India was, although the novel was a new genre in India, there were few translations. What writers in India did was to imitate European models. In fact, some novelists definitely acknowledged that they had imitated Western models. Okay. For example, O. Chandu Menon, the Malayalam novelist who wrote Indulekha, that was the first novel in Malayalam, first full-fledged novel in Malayalam, said that he was writing something like those novel books of the English. Okay. Clearly indicating that he was imitating European models. Right. And we have this strange case of Rabindranath Tagore, the only Indian to win a Nobel Prize for Literature. So he translated his own poems into English. In fact, he was anticipating a large-scale large-scale translation that happened almost a century later. And we also know about the accommodations that he made to fit into a Western paradigm of literature by self-censoring his work, by omitting certain. That is another story. But his translation won acclaim in the West. And ultimately in 1913, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. But the prolific activity of translating Indian works into European languages, especially English, happened after 1950. That's another story. This was a big movement. But it began earlier with Tagore and along with certain other writers in the first half of the 20th century. It was set in motion. Okay. And we have this interesting instance of the nationalist movement supporting translation. We know that Gandhiji's autobiography, My Experiments with Truth, was translated into almost all Indian languages before 1947. And you have the work of translation encouraged by the Hindi Prajar Sabha, okay, translating works from Hindi into other Indian languages, and vice versa. We have Premchand as an author in Hindi who figured largely in translation of the uh, early 20th century. And this was actually a dress rehearsal for what was to happen a little later in the second half of the 20th century, after 1947, with the setting up of the Sahitya Academy and the National Book Trust. Okay, now just a glimpse at translation theory. Yeah, the arrival of structuralism set in motion a certain approach to translation. The structuralists looked at languages as a compendium of structures. And a linguist like Halliday, for example, would say that if you compare the structures of languages, that would facilitate translation. So if you have a subject predicate, a certain kind of subject predicate structure in one language and a comparable structure in another language, it would seem that it makes translation easy. And a little later in the 20th century, in 1965, an entire book was written based on this approach. That was by J.C. Catford, A Linguistic Theory of Translation. And structuralism also encouraged the study of many minor languages in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. People studied these languages, and there was a renewed interest in this language after Orientalism. Orientalism was the first movement which encouraged the study of Asian language. But after that, structuralism. A linguist like Leonard Bloomfield studied many American Indian languages, for example. But certain other interesting paradigms were developing. For example, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. What is this? It tells you that translation is nearly impossible. That's because different languages segment experience differently. So one language might have a certain number of words for a certain phenomenon, making minor distinctions. For example, the number of words in a language spoken in the Arctic Circle. They have long winters, they have ice and snow almost the year round. So different words for snow, different words for sand in Arabic and other Semitic languages, different words of bodies of water in a language like Malayalam, a language spoken by people living in a territory which abounds with water. Okay, all kinds of water, all different kinds of ponds and lakes. Okay, so kinship terms in Indian languages. Okay, you have Chacha, Mosa, Poa. Okay, different names to indicate kinship between people in a family. So other languages don't have so many terms. In English, you only have uncle for everything. So different languages have different ways of looking at the world, looking at personal relations, looking at natural phenomena. So if you want to say Foa in English, you have to say it in a roundabout way. You can't segment experience. So Sapir and Whorf, okay, two linguists, Benjamin Lee Whorf and Albert Sapir. They tried to look at certain languages which have peculiar ways of segmenting experience. They looked at an American Indian language which had the same word for all flying objects. So whether it is a glider or a bird or a human being attempting to fly from a hill using a certain kind of wing, whatever it is, they all had the same name, flying object. So you had to specify what kind of flying object it is by using another term. It's the same word for, different words for water in different states. Running water, still water. So all these experiences, according to them, proved that proper translation was impossible. Of course, this is only hypothesis. We do translate. We get around such difficulties. Of course, and another philosopher, Willard Quine, talked about the inconsistency of meaning. What you mean by something in a particular, the kind of meaning formats, semantic zones in one language are not compatible with semantic zones in another language. They are different. So here again, like Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf, Willard Quine was also talking about the impossibility of translation. We already saw what Robert Frost said. And we have two important writers, critics, philosophers, translation scholars, linguists, talking about things which were to be discussed in detail later. The first is an essay by Walter Benjamin, The Task of the Translator. This anticipates much of what was to be discussed later, anticipating discussions on translatability. Why certain texts appear to be more translatable than others. Foreignizing translations, what Walter Benjamin advocated. If you're translating into German from Hindi, you must try to make German like, he must try to turn German into Hindi. What Lawrence Venuti called foreignizing translations. What Benjamin called the afterlife of a translation. Okay, what happens when a text passes into another language? A very serious issue discussed in translation studies later in the 20th century. Like that. And then you have Roman Jakobsen's essay on linguistic aspects of translation, 1941. Among other things, it discusses a type of translation called intersemiotic translation or rendering between different semiotic systems, different media. This was to be discussed in detail in the later part of the 20th century as both audiovisual translation and adaptation. Right. So we come to the end of this module on translation from the Renaissance to our modern times. And you have these references for you. Matthew Arnold's On Translating Homer, which I mentioned, and the work you are already familiar with, Mona Baker's Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies, 2001, Susan Basnett's Translation Studies, with which you are already familiar, and Walter Benjamin's The Translator's Task, and J.C. Catford's A Linguistic Theory of Translation, and this essay on Willard Quine's work on meaning by A.C. Lampert and P.D. Shaw, Quine on Meaning and Translation. And then, of course, that full-fledged work on translation by Alexander Fraser Tytler, Essay on the Principles of Translation. Now, let's take a short break. We come to the end of part 1 of this module. So we'll be back after this short break. Thank you.